So I think one of the things that's really good about a meeting like this, bringing together folks, we've got writers, we've got workers, we've got organizers from the labor movement, talking about the importance of radicals both in labor's history and moving forward, is because it's the kind of conversation we don't get to have often enough in the labor movement, even though that wasn't always the case. You know, the day that we commemorate on May 1st, on May Day around the world, is a commemoration of the fight for the 8-hour day that was begun in Chicago and around the country. And at that time, radicals were very open radicals, as socialists, anarchists, people who were called themselves socialists one day and anarchists the next, were very much at the heart of that fight. And in a lot of ways, the task that I think a lot of us have taken for ourselves has been trying to overcome decades of radicals being purged from the labor movement that really happened ever since the time of McCarthyism. So this is a really, I think, an important discussion for us to be having. I'm going to try to give the history of the first May Day in 1 minute. So you can time me on this, but we just don't, so most people here, thank you. Most people here will probably know it, but so I just want, for those people who don't, I want to give just the briefest history. The reason why people around the day, workers around the world, socialists choose May 1st to celebrate is because that was the day of a massive general strike, particularly in Chicago, but around this country, of tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands of workers fighting for the 8-hour day. And it's something that came to be known as the Great Upheaval of 1886. In Chicago, where it was strongest, you had tens of thousands of people going out on strike. I kind of lost my notes. And it was actually going incredibly well for a few days, and a lot of workers were winning. They're forcing their employers to give them the 8-hour day. Till the night of May 4th, when there was a protest going on against the police who had shot 4 workers the night before on strike in the McCormick Reaper Works. And at this protest, a bomb was thrown that killed 7 police officers. The fact that 4 workers had been killed the day before did not produce a national outcry. The fact that 7 police officers were killed the day after did. And there was a frame-up, and some of the leaders of the 8-hour movement, the radical leaders, including Albert Parsons and August Spies, were executed a year later, even though it was known that they actually weren't even at the Haymarket when the bombing took place. That's the very, and from that point on, the labor movement is celebrated, both commemorated the people who died, the martyrs, but also the incredibly powerful movement that always kicked off some of the modern global labor movement. That's my history. I probably take more than 1 minute, but I was trying to make that very quick history of May 1st. I want to just take a little more time, let's call it 4 minutes, to draw out what I think are a couple of lessons that we can learn, even from my very shallow history that I just gave of the first May Day. The first lesson is, and now I'm going to get to my, try to look up what the hell I wrote about it, was that the same people who were executed, people like Albert Parsons, his partner Lucy Parsons, August Spies, the radicals, the anarchists and socialists played a very important role in making that May 1st protest happen and in making it strong. It was a wider labor movement that was coming together around that 8-hour day, but it was the radicals, particularly in the International Working Persons Association, note that they call themselves the Working Persons Association, who actually helped take the movement for the 8-hour day and give it roots in the unskilled workers movement among women, among immigrants who didn't speak English, and really deepen that strike. And then those unskilled, and also gave it more radical demand. It was the radicals who said not only should we be fighting for the 8-hour day, but that shouldn't come with a pay cut. We should be getting 8 hours work for the same pay. And that demand was taken up in earnest by a lot of those immigrants, those women, those unskilled workers, and in turn fed back into the more mainstream union movement and radicalized it too. And that's one of the main reasons why people like Albert Parsons and August Spies were targeted after the Haymarket bombing to be executed, because they were key leaders of that movement. So I think that's one lesson to take today, that radicals have often, even when they're working isolated for years, when the right moment comes, they can play a key role in pushing movement forward. Second quick point I just wanted to make was that those radical organizations in Chicago were often the places where immigrant workers and native-born American workers came together and formed bonds that didn't really happen in the rest of the labor movement. Chicago in 1886 was a place where now there's segregation the same that it was today, but a lot of the immigrant workers, the Czech workers, the German workers, Jewish workers, didn't speak English, but all had their own separate newspapers, and it was really in the International Working Persons Association. I think you can almost look at the relationship between Albert Parsons and Lucy Parsons and August Spies and some of the other leading German socialists, the bonds that they formed over decades as radicals fighting together, trusting each other, really came to fruition on days like May 1st, 1886, and coordinating the action of workers who generally lived very segregated and separate lives. And that's a role that the radical left can play when it's doing what it should be doing. And then the last point I want to make, so we can get on with what we now have as our full panel, is that I think it's important to see that what made the radical people, the Parsons and Spies, the anarchists, the socialists, what made them radical wasn't actually the demand for the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day was a demand that was incredibly popular among workers, and it had been going on for a couple of decades. It was their understanding of what it was going to take to win that demand, which is what really made them radical. You know, back in 1867, 19 years before the Haymarket affair, Illinois had passed a bill saying that there should be an 8-hour day. And what happened is the day after it was enacted, the bosses of Chicago and Illinois just refused to implement it. And the state was like, oh, I guess it's not realistic then. Workers go bananas. The next day, they're all out protesting, and they get arrested for breaking the law, even though the bosses had broken the 8-hour law that had just been passed. It was those experiences that taught the radicals that we're not going to win this demand just by getting a law passed. We're going to have to force it through by direct action and strikes that are going to actually, at every workplace, that's going to, or at least the key ones, that's going to force this through. And I mention that because I think it's important today, even when radicals in the labor movement can sometimes feel like, kind of cut off or isolated. And I think today we're dealing with a broader workers movement where expectations have become so low. You know what I mean? The idea that just being happy with the job is important. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that most of our demands, whenever workers do go on strike and you're on the picket line, you're talking to people, you're supporting them, they still have far-reaching ideas of what dignity at work is, the kind of world that they should work in. And what makes radicals, again, distinct is not that we necessarily, our demands are so different than the rest of the labor movement, but that we have maybe a more hardened, hard-headed understanding of what kind of fight it's going to take to win those demands. So I just want to leave it at that, and then I want to get this panel started.
So Danny totally set me up to make one of my favorite points, which is that in 1886 they wanted to execute Lucy Parsons too, and they figured that they couldn't get away with executing a woman. And this is a story that applies to a few of my favorite radical women throughout history. They wanted to kill the women because they actually knew that they were more threatening than the men, but, sexism actually occasionally worked in our favor. Anyway, because Lucy Parsons lived for another 50-something years of being a radical organizer. Anyway, so right now I write about labor in what we talk about a lot as being the new economy. It's not that the jobs that I'm talking about people organizing in and working in are new jobs. It's just that the old jobs that we sort of presumed that the economy was built upon are fewer and fewer. That they've moved overseas, that manufacturing is happening in places like Bangladesh, where buildings are collapsing on workers, and that's unfortunately a thing I don't know enough about to talk to you about much tonight. But so the economy that we have now is low-wage service work. It is care work. It is largely part-time work. It is largely done by women. It is largely done by immigrants. It is done by people of color. And it has been for a while. Jumping back to what Danny was talking about, the history of May Day, that was in the days before we had industrial unions. That in those days, the industrial labor was this sort of unskilled, as Danny said, work that we heard about that was done by immigrants, by women, by children. We've sort of gotten rid of child labor. But back then, that was the low-skill work. That was the unskilled work. That was the work that was seen as not terribly... The people who did it were expendable, were easily replaced. And today, when we hear people talking about low-skilled work, unskilled workers, when we hear the immigration debate and we hear people talking about bringing in high-skilled workers from some countries and educated tech workers, and then we talk about the unskilled workers who are going to come work in farms or take care of your children. That term has always been about who was doing that work more than what the work actually was and the degree of skill that it actually requires. We all know this. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that the reason that industrial jobs became good jobs was not that they were inherently great jobs, but because people fought and died for those to be good jobs. People fought for the 8-hour day. People fought for decent treatment, decent wages, health care, benefits, the whole nine. And they won those for part of the workforce. They won those for these industrial jobs that were largely done by men, that were in factories, that were easier to organize, and people who were doing other work. I mean, in some cases were explicitly left out of labor law. In the case of domestic work, farm work, were very, very explicitly left out of labor law, again, because at the time those were mostly done by black workers. And this is absolutely central to how we talk about work today, all of these things. So we got the middle class. We got men working 40-hour weeks-ish and getting paid overtime, usually when they worked more than 40 hours. And the entire way that work was structured was set up around this idea of a nuclear family, heterosexual couple, man's working 40-hour work week. The woman, if she works, she picks up a few hours here and there. She works part-time. She doesn't need a full-time job, and she doesn't need to be paid a living wage, a family-sustaining wage, because she's presumed to be married, and there's presumed to be a husband at home who is bringing home the bacon, the actual paycheck. And so when we look at these jobs now, when we look at fast food work, when we look at home care, when we look at domestic work, and you think about that these are jobs that were dominated by women. Walmart was very explicit about hiring women when Walmart first got started and building its workforce on largely white women who were in the rural South, largely the wives of farmers who had never worked for wages before at all. But what they really did have was this wonderful service ethic, that these were women who went to church and they believed in serving their community and caring about their community. Bethany Morton has written a wonderful book about all of this, called To Serve God in Walmart, and I have to plug that every time I talk about this, because it's just a mind-blowingly good book. But so now what's happened in the so-called new economy is that men are stuck doing these jobs. And not that we shouldn't have organized them before, because we should have organized them before. Now we really, really have to organize them because they're what we've got, because the fastest growing jobs in this country right now are retail, food service, and home health care. These are the jobs of the future, and they don't have to be lousy jobs, just like factory jobs didn't have to be lousy jobs. So I've been writing about a few of these things, in particular in the last year or so. The fast food organizing that's been going on that started right here in New York. We should all be proud of this. I was just in Seattle for a couple of days hosting a low-wage worker storytelling event. And it almost blew my mind that the minimum wage in Washington State is $9.18 an hour, and it's indexed to inflation. And I don't ever want to say, you guys should be happy with what you have, because they shouldn't be happy. They're still broke. They're making $9.18 an hour, and it's cheaper to live in Seattle, and they're still not being able to make ends meet. But here, it's going to be 3 years before we get to $9 an hour, even with the minimum wage increase they just passed. We have people who are working for $7.25 an hour still in New York, who are adults. The average age in the fast food industry is 28 years old. These are not teenagers. These are not kids working for money to buy an Xbox. These are people who have to sustain a family on whatever they manage to get home. Walmart organizing, everybody has heard about this, that there have been strikes at Walmarts across the country, that these are jobs that average $8 and change an hour. And domestic work and home care organizing are things that I'm deeply impressed by, because it's really hard to organize workers in one place. It's very hard to organize workers in a restaurant, on a shop floor. Organizing workers whose workplace is somebody's home, where the only person that they often see all day is their client. Whether or not that client is technically the boss is sadly another subject that I don't really have time to get into here. But that organizing is happening is one of the most impressive things that I've seen, and one of the most positive developments for the labor movement that I've seen in my lifetime, probably. And again, I want to make the point that these are jobs that are not new. They're not things that we've just started having to do for money in recent years. They've been around. People had a chance to try and organize them. think, had some success. People have been trying to organize Walmart for a very long time and failing. But that the way that people think about these jobs, again, that they are unskilled or low skilled, that this is because of who they've been done by historically. And so in order to talk about organizing these jobs, in order to talk about changing these jobs, making them better, we have to talk about the work that goes into them, the emotional work that goes into them, as well as the physical work that goes into them, because they are physically demanding jobs. We have to talk about what skill is and what we mean when we say low skill and unskilled and high skill. We need to talk about what are skills, that dealing with human beings and not stabbing them in the face is as much a skill as lifting a heavy box or doing a complicated math problem. It's just a different skill. To really value this new economy work and to actually make these jobs into good jobs, we're going to actually have to value skills that have been traditionally women's skills. We're going to have to really value emotional labor as much as we have valued traditionally men's skills and physical labor. And I will stop there.
Most of, I think, what I'll talk about comes from my experience of being a Black woman fighting for a space in labor and pretty much everything, since that's just what we got to do. So I'll talk about that. They approached me to talk about kind of labor and anti-racism, and I really did contemplate making the content of my talk just the word hate. That's it. I just hate dropping my boom. But I'll talk more. I won't just leave you with Haiti. But I do want to talk about the fact that labor will always exist. Workers are going to organize and fight and struggle against exploitation, regardless of whether unions exist or not. And so that's why I go all the way back to Haiti when I want to talk about race and labor, as that was a state that was created when workers rebelled, and they won. And they had a lot of consequences after that because of white supremacy and, just France being on some other shit, for lack of a better term that I can say right now. But, I go all the way back there when I want to talk about workers of color, when I want to talk about anti-racist struggle. I start at Haiti. But so for my talk, I really want to make 3 points, really, kind of looking at racism as a historically effective tool to erode labor's power and labor's rights. And also, I want to talk a few examples of successful or impactful examples of labor organizing that has really espoused anti-racism as a central value. And also, kind of this idea that labor really doesn't have a choice if it wants to stay relevant, looking at labor trends. There's one thing to be like, oh, anti-racism is important because it makes us feel good and we're all people and we should all hang out together. But honestly, that's not the case. We're not all the same, and I don't really have to like you, but the fact is labor has no choice. I think Sarah already kind of made a couple of nods to labor trends of who is in these sectors, these growing job sectors, who the people are. And like I said, you go all the way back to Haiti, I'll tell you who's a threat when we organize. So anti-racism is not just important, it's necessary if labor wants to stay relevant. So that's bottom line. This isn't about just me pleading for something. No, it's just on the real. So as far as racism used as a tool to divide, Sarah already talked about people being left out of labor law by name, straight up by name, talking about domestic workers and agricultural workers. And that was for a reason. That was a compromise that they had to make with the South, being like, you're not going to be organizing these Black people down here. No, it's not going to happen. And so they were left out of labor law. And people were like, oh, well, they're unorganizable, blah, blah, blah. I had all these terms to rationalize it. But it was about race. That's it. There's nothing else. We can say all sorts of things. It was about race. So let me jump way ahead, talking about racism as a divide again. Let's look at Wisconsin. A lot. I was in the Capitol. My brother lives in Madison. 1 out of 10 Black people in Madison. Poor guy. No, there are a few. But so I went to see my brother, and I wanted to be in the Capitol a little bit and see what was going on. And he was just talking about kind of the discussion about what was going on with Scott Walker, right? And so you look at kind of the numbers of who was supporting Scott Walker. So they were saying that union households had a large portion supporting Walker. A big number. I think it was over 40%, something crazy. Union households supporting this guy. But then he essentially garnered no black vote, 0. And then you hear he's on TV talking about, do you want Wisconsin to look like Milwaukee? And everyone's like, oh, well, Milwaukee, it has all these issues. They're losing jobs, blah, blah, blah. The economy's down. Like, fine, you can try and rationalize that way. But I'll tell you what people heard when he said, I don't want Wisconsin to look like Milwaukee. All the black people in Wisconsin live in Milwaukee. They said, I don't want to look like Milwaukee. I don't want them here. I'm going to vote for Walker. So you have these union households that are literally voting their rights away because Walker was not afraid to make it about race. For some reason, the left, Dems, whoever, we were afraid, and the right beats us to it. And when they talk about race first, it's not pretty. It doesn't look good. And so when we're sitting here being like, oh, I don't want to talk about race. Oh, let's not make it about that. It's not, let's say something else. You're going to lose, And so that's what happens. You've got union households. And so, I wanted to bring that up because that was something that happened very recently. I saw it happen. It was so blatant. And I was just like, if this is where we're at, we're not going to make it. So that's just something to bring up. And now I think even this is just something that's been going on historically, kind of the attack on public sector in general. I was writing an email to Danny about what I was talking about. I was like all mad at work, just like, kind of writing a joke, but it was kind of serious when I was saying you can really hear the racist language used that would take away rights of the public sector a lot, where they talk, and it's, the language really mirrors what a lot of people say about public or like social services, like welfare, right? We've got the like welfare queen and all this sort of stuff. These lazy, ungrateful workers. And really, they should just say black people. These black people. We don't want to give these black people anything. But they just keep coming up with these other things to say about how they're lazy and blah, blah, blah. And it's like all these different public sector, jobs that actually affect a lot of folks. And everyone's sitting there signing their rights away because it's this racist language that is speaking to them. And I grew up in Kentucky, right? So I'm used to that. I hear it all the time. I've gone into neighborhoods in eastern Kentucky that are some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. And hearing folks, what resonates with them is this really racially tinged, racially coded language that is setting them behind, stripping their rights away. But it's because, I was reading this book, I actually reviewed it, Bill Fletcher wrote it, great guy. Talking about a bunch of myths about unions, and he has this line that says, white workers are taught to prioritize their racial identity as white over their reality as part of the laboring classes and later as part of the working class. And that's huge. That is really huge. In a place like Kentucky, right, where people are really struggling, it's one of the poorest states, but people are really grasping onto this identity, onto whiteness as their claim, and it's completely setting them behind as workers, and they're willing to just completely not look at that, just to be separated from the folks who they should be fighting with. So that's the first point as far as racism used to divide. But let's go to, I guess, kind of a more hopeful light, where people have actually been able to use anti-racism as a value that's central to their organizing. So recently, I want to talk a little bit about the Chicago Teachers Union, about the Chicago Teachers Union strike. I was impressed. I really was. I was looking at people who supported the strike, and they did a poll for the city, for Chicago, and it was like 50% of the city was supporting the strike. You don't get 50% of a big city like Chicago to support a public worker strike. You do not get, that has not, I don't remember the last time that happened. It doesn't happen. Because it's something that's really affecting people, and so it's like, you would suppose it'd be like 5% of the city supports this. No, but about the majority of the city was like totally on board. Like, yes, we feel you, Chicago Teachers Union. We feel you, CTU. And it's because they did their work. They really did their work. They were organizing for this strike, like, for such a long time with the community, talking to students, talking to their parents, saying that this is about you all. And they actually, and what I was saying before, where we're afraid to make things about race, they weren't afraid, and they beat them to it. Yep. They said, this is about race. I'm going to tell you who goes to these schools. I'm going to tell you who's in the public school system. I'm going to tell you how you don't care about them. I'm going to tell you why. And they weren't afraid to say it out loud. I mean, Karen Lewis is basically like on TV being like, you are a racist. And me as a black woman, like just throwing bows into organized labor. Like, I was so excited to see that because it's like, here she is going up against Rahm Emanuel, Obama's best friend. Yeah. Just being like, bring it, like, please, I dare you right now. Like, I've got Chicago behind me, what do you have? And it's like, I thought that was really important, you know? I thought it was really extremely important. And that's when you say, when people are like, oh, you know, we should have anti-racism, but I don't know if it can work. It can. They fought and they won. It can. So, you know, that's just one example in our recent history to look at. And so I'm going to go a little further back, because this is actually where my background is with welfare rights organizing. And looking at the National Welfare Rights Organization, formerly the National Welfare Rights Union. They used to go by union, actually, and I thought that was a really incredible way to talk about them as an organization, calling themselves a union, because everyone's like, oh, well, you know, like, do all of them work or whatever. Like, no, they're a union. And they really brought up an idea of organizing across workplaces and really building movements for low-wage workers, for people of color. It was about dignity, it was about respect. It was about the work that we do will not be defined by your racist notions of who we are, by your sexist notions of who we are, your classist notions of who we are. It'll be defined by the fact that I put my soul into it. You know what I'm saying? And so they were really grounded in self-definition and defining themselves as a union and defining their work as respectable work, as they were dignified. And that's something that I think is really incredible. There's a lot of things about actual, you know, using self-definition to your advantage. And so the last thing I want to talk about as far as labor trends, this one's kind of, you know, I don't want to make any of the statisticians upset in the room, so I won't throw out too many numbers. But, you know, just in general, as far as like labor trends, there have been a lot of surveys as far, and like, they were talking about a lot of workers of color and immigrant workers actually more pro-union in general. Maybe that's because it's like we I don't know, we know struggle. I don't know, the struggle doesn't start or end at work for a lot of us. I'll just like, that's just a given. It's not going to begin or end when we go to work. You know, you walk out of, when you wake up and you walk out of your room, it hits you, you know. I get on the train and I'm just like, this racist person is in my face right now. And so, you know, maybe that's what contributes to our propensity for wanting to organize a lot. But as far as, you know, if we're looking at restoring kind of the public sector and where we need to be organizing, you're looking at a lot of, you know, take SEIU, for example. I happen to work for SEIU. One of the largest growing unions, and that's because they're doing a lot in service sector, a lot in healthcare, home care, and that's a lot of women and people of color, women of color, and it's just booming. And I think it would be stupid for labor to not recognize the power within anti-racist organizing, the power within putting that as a central value. Like, it's just straight up, like, those are the people you're organizing right now. And it's like, everyone always brings this thing, how can labor stay relevant? It's like the question I hear at every panel meeting, oh, how will labor be relevant? I'll tell you how labor is relevant, right? I'm gonna tell you, and if you decide not to do it, it's on you. Labor is relevant, labor stays relevant by being on the right side of things that matter. That's how you do it. So, like, it's really that easy. You know, I was just talking to my friend Marlena about that. You know, we were just coming up with little things like, you know, there was, I think, a group somewhere in Illinois, there was a bunch of community groups lobbying to close down a prison. And then Ashley was like, hold on, keep the prison open. Our guards are there. And it's like, you know, I feel you, like, but that's short-sighted. All right? Like, let's actually talk about the prison industrial complex and why it's really plaguing the working class and why you shouldn't be lobbying to keep it open, Ashley. Then you've got Keystone. AFL is like, no, Giles. And it's like, no, AFL. Let's talk about it. This is not the right thing to do. So again, like, you want to be relevant, just be on the right side of things that matter. Racism, terrible. Be on the right side of things. Like, I don't know what else to say. Be on the right side of things that matter. If these are the folks who are organizing, if you want to grow, if you want to be a movement for working people, just understand what matters to us and just take a stand. Don't wait for them. Take a stand.
I don't have too much to say, but actually we came to talk more about to be a radical. I was the leader of the Hot Crusty campaign campaign. And one of the most important things in that place, all on that place, we are immigrants. And inside in that shop, we have a lot of abuse. The owner or the management, they have the wage theft, and a lot of kind of different issues. So we have a very successful campaign, but one of the most important things on this campaign, the workers, we lead that campaign. We don't let nobody else do it. So actually, the workers, we are in front of that fight. So one of the most important things that one of the core values of the organization Laundry Worker Center is training the workers so they know about the rights. And also, all together, we're working with different organizations and different groups, and they'll help us to support our campaign. And in the same time, we are learning more about the movement, the history about the movement in the United States. So how the immigrants built this country, but at the end, still we don't have rights. So one of the most important things we need to train in, and that's what we're doing in Laundry Worker Center. We train each worker, they want to be part of a campaign, to they lead that campaign. Because right now, in many unions, we saw the leaders of these big unions, they support the official electors, or they expend all money in democratic parties or something like that. Instead, use that money to training the workers, to training the people. So, and actually, we don't believe we're going to have any kind of victory if we're going to believe in the official electors or we're going together on that way. We are the workers, we are the working class, and we need to start divide that. So I think we're going to be very radical when the people decide don't support the politics or other this kind of people. That's when we start building again the labor movement. So
First, a lot of what I'm going to say has already been said by the speakers on the panel, which is exciting. I'm excited to be on a panel like this tonight. I'll try not to repeat, but elaborate a little bit on what's been put out there. So I want to start by saying that 2 weeks ago, less than 1/3 of the active UF team members voted in our leadership election. That's an incredibly depressing figure. Actually, more retirees voted than the active membership. This actually matches a general trend within labor union elections right now, where we see less and less of the active membership voting. And I would argue, and I think many people in the room would agree with me, that union members on the whole are incredibly demoralized and unconvinced that a change in our union leaderships could actually make any kind of difference in our everyday lives or our working conditions. But as socialists and radicals within the teachers' union and other unions, we actually have a different vision of what a union could look like, and we understand that, in fact, the leadership of a union does make a difference, as evidenced by CORE this year. So socialists, like other radicals and leftists, recognize that the ultimate enemy is not just our boss. We see past the immediate workplace grievances, as important as they are, to a larger fight against the programs of austerity and neoliberalism. We see the current attacks against the teachers' union within the context of an outright attack on the working class and our standard of living in general. It's critical to position the attacks on the teacher union within a bigger framework. Somebody already talked about the depressing numbers of unionized workers in this country right now, and that public sector workers actually represent the largest percentage of unionized workers in the country. Teachers represent a huge number of this. I think postal workers are the only other larger group of unionized workers, and New York City teachers represent the largest local in the country. On top of that, it's important to point out that black workers are more likely than Asian, whites, or Hispanics to be unionized. And so once we have all of that together, we see that attacks against the public sector specifically must be confronted head-on as the racist assaults that they are. As teachers in New York City, in the UFT, as I said, the largest local in the country, and essentially the controlling hand of the AFT, which is our national umbrella union, we have the potential to have a disproportionate impact on the direction of labor and education. So let's look specifically at the attacks on teachers that we're experiencing now in New York City and across the country. For every attack on teacher unions comes a corresponding attack on our schools and our students' right to education. So for example, we experience teacher evaluations as educators while our students in the classroom experience high-stakes testing and minimized curriculum. We experience attacks on teacher tenure and our seniority where our students experience their schools being closed and charter schools being open because they represent a non-unionized workforce. Teachers and schools experience budget cuts and threatened layoffs by the mayor, but our students experience rising class sizes and deteriorating conditions within our schools. And once again, we see that all of the issues that I just listed happen in inner city public schools. Communities of color and schools that are a part of those communities represent the front line of racist school closings, privatization, and erosion of meaningful curriculum and pedagogy. That is coupled with a high-stakes testing agenda. So when viewed in this broader framework, which socialists and radicals do bring to the table, it's possible to see the attacks on public education and public sector unions for what they are. Racist attacks on communities of color intended to drive down the standard of living for workers across the board and further divide the working class, making it more and more difficult to build a unified fight back. This analysis is critical in order for us to actually develop a strategy that can win, which I think Michelle already spoke to really well. Across the country and through history, it's radicals within teachers' unions and the labor left in general that have argued for a broad-based workers' movement that takes up issues of oppression that affect the communities in which we work, along with fights for good contracts, living wages, and job security. So last spring, as MORE was forming, we democratically voted to make our slogan, "Our working conditions are our students' learning conditions," along with the slogan, "The Social Justice Caucus of the UFT." MORE is a diverse group. We are composed of many groups throughout the teacher left, both groups that have worked historically inside the union to change it from within, and groups that have worked outside the union and have different politics. What we share is a willingness and hope to build a fighting rank-and-file-led union. Our diversity is most definitely a strength. However, it's not always been easy to come to consensus, and we've quickly learned the importance of open democratic debates and decisions. It's been the role of radicals and socialists within MORE from the beginning, and others that may not identify as such yet, but are quickly coming to the same strategic conclusions to argue for a social justice orientation. As I said before, this has not always been easy, and we don't always convince everyone around us that this is the right road to take. We are continually challenged up until last week when we're being attacked post-elections for taking social justice as our slogan, that possibly that's why we didn't get a better showing. We're continually being challenged with the argument that social justice issues do not fit within the purview of a union, that a teachers' union should only take up the issues that affect teachers. I agree. A teachers' union should take up the issues that affect teachers, but what I disagree with is that those issues don't also affect my students and the community in which I serve. Our work then, as socialists and radicals, is to consistently argue that the issues affecting teachers are one and the same with the issues that affect the communities we serve, and that we will only win if we unite and fight together. I'd like to give a couple of examples of this just to convince anyone in the room who's still unsure of what I'm saying. I think that high-stakes testing is the perfect example. I teach in a high school for recently arrived immigrant students. I get them in their first year when they're brand new to the city and to the country and to the language. I also teach a living environment regents curriculum. So for those of you who are familiar with New York City and our education system, you know what this means. For those of you who are not, quickly, a regents exam, you take one for every subject in order to get a regents diploma, which is what you need to get into most colleges. You have to pass 5 of these exams. So my students come to me as new English speakers, and it's my job to help them enter the country. It's my job to help them build supportive relationships with each other, with me, with their school community, to begin to teach them English, and ultimately, as unfortunate as it may be, to prepare them for a very high stakes and quite difficult biology exam that they will take after 2 years. My students often do not pass this exam, and as their teacher, I don't see that as problematic because they can take it 2 more times, 3 more times after they're with me. I see the incredible gains that they've made after 2 years. They're now English speakers. They have developed a culture of community and a school in a new country. They can navigate New York City, countless other things. But you can imagine what it will do to my classroom environment, to my teaching, and to my students' learning when my job security becomes attached to the pass rate on that exam. My working conditions are very much my students' learning conditions. I teach in the South Bronx, which most of the people in this room probably know is the area with the highest rate of asthma in the country. Asthma can be caused by a whole assortment of different things, namely air pollutants, cockroaches, rat feces. In short, living in poverty leads to increased propensity of asthma. When students in my class continually miss school because they have asthma, because they live in the South Bronx, and they can't get the health care that they need, this affects their learning, and ultimately it affects my teaching. Their living conditions, the conditions in which they learn, are my teaching conditions. There's no way to separate these things out. And there's simply no way in my mind to argue that it doesn't benefit both of us to link arms and fight for their rights and for mine. A social justice perspective then does not mean in any way that we don't fight for bread and butter issues like a good contract. Instead, a social justice orientation recognizes that workers are connected to the communities in which they work. Their rights are inextricably tied up with the rights of the community that they serve. And an attack on me as an educator, as a worker, is essentially an attack on every worker across the board. The Chicago Teachers Union, led by CORE, which has had socialists and radicals playing a key part from the very beginning, gives us a perfect example of what this looks like in practice. And I'm glad that Michelle talked about the specific anti-racist orientation of the CTU strike, so I'm not going to go into that. But it's important to note that when they walked out on strike this fall, they walked out of their schools because of contractual issues. But they made demands that were not contractual. They made demands about arts programs, resources, air conditioners, and yes, teacher evaluations, because they recognized that that impacts their students' learning conditions. And they did that arm in arm with communities. They weren't striking over how much they got paid. And as a result, they weren't striking only over how much they got paid. I think that's an important distinction. It's fine to have demands about pay raises, but they weren't only striking over how much they got paid. They continued to build with, and now they continue to build with their communities against school closings, and they have a grassroots approach. If you go to their webpage right now, it's exciting. I mean, like the difference between their webpage and the UFT webpage is just... It's sad, but it's exciting to see what it could look like. But it's important to note that they walked out of their schools, and as Michelle already said, they won. And the reason for that is because they had a perspective on joining arms with the communities in which they teach. More recently held a Schools Our Children Deserve forum, linking together high-stakes testing and criminalization of youth, and participated in a 500-person strong demo at Tweed against high-stakes testing. More will continue to build alliances with parent and teacher groups like Change the Stakes and like Time Out from Testing that recognize the connections between students' rights to relevant curriculum and teachers' rights as professionals to determine the best pedagogy and rich material for our students. And as radicals within MORE, we will continue to make arguments and connections between the criminalization of our young people, particularly young men of color, high-stakes testing, and punitive no-tolerance discipline policies, which in short make up the school-to-prison pipeline. As socialists, we see unions as the front line of defense for workers against employers and strongholds of workers' power. But we also see them positioned to be much more than that, to play a role in the wider struggles of the working class as a whole. Therefore, socialists have a strategic orientation on building within our unions in order to strengthen both workers' power and the larger left. Moreover, within capitalism, we view the working class as a central agent of change due to our ability to shut down the system at the point of production. Because we view struggles against oppression within the context of capitalism, we understand that the power of workers is central to winning fights against racism, sexism, and anti-immigrant fights, and so on. Therefore, we don't see strong unions as only good for winning fights in the workplace, but as critical components of winning much larger social gains. I mentioned before that radicals have a different vision of unionism than what we see now in the UFT, and I think that this is worth elaborating. The UFT, sadly, operates currently as a bureaucratic, top-down service union with little to absolutely no attempt to organize their membership. The opposite is actually possible, even though it's not happening, and it's sometimes hard to believe. A union capable of fighting and building alliances is one whose foundation is not the small leadership body that's been elected into power, but rather the rank-and-file membership, engaged and active. A union where every school, and this is actually important because currently the UFT makes absolutely no attempt to ensure that every school even has a chapter leader or a chapter. So a union where, I mean, every school has an organized, active chapter fighting for their rights and advocating for the students and parents of their community and supported by the larger membership body of the union. This is a radically different vision than what we have now, and we are sadly far from the vision. But we do believe that we can get there, one school at a time. When CORE took over the CTU, this was referenced a little bit before, they literally restructured their union. They rebuilt it. They tore it up and built something new. They built an organization of organizers, people that go into schools and talk to teachers. And as Michelle mentioned, before they decided to strike almost a year ago, they had been preparing for a good year before that. They had organizers in schools talking to teachers, educating them about the issues, and talking to the communities in which they work, so that when it was time to go out, they had their teachers and their communities behind them. The strike was democratically initiated. That meant that it wasn't the leadership that just said it was time to go out. It was the membership that actually made that decision. The strike was democratically led. It was democratically organized. And when it was time to accept a contract, it was democratically ended, something that we can't say about very many other labor actions. So within MORE, we as socialists will continue to argue for an open democratic membership where decisions are made by the membership and not by small leadership bodies in open democratic discussions. And we will continue to argue for an outward formation that looks to build alliances with those struggling around us. Well, we here in New York City are far from a union that resembles anything democratic. Anything democratic or rank-and-file led, there is a reason to hope and continue to build. MORE put our name out less than a year ago, and we put our name out as the Social Justice Caucus of the UFT. And within less than a year in these elections, we were the single caucus to make gains in that election. That's what happened about. What this means is that Unity, the current leadership who's been in leadership for about 50 years, actually lost votes in every single sector. And MORE, compared to the opposition in years past, gained percentages in every single sector. We can't say for sure what the numbers mean. There's no exact analysis or exit voting polls. But what we can say is that there is a qualitative difference between this year's election and elections in years past. And by that, one example is NYCOR, who is a group of young radical educators and has a huge stronghold in the city. NYCOR is a huge name. In this election, they stood firmly with MORE. And when Karen Lewis spoke at their conference, they allowed MORE members afterwards to give a pitch for MORE and pass a hat, where we were able to raise hundreds of dollars within literally 5 minutes. This is a different place than the union opposition has been in years past. What's more is that we see the slow rise of a grassroots, community-led movement to defend public education, which is manifested in actions like years past of PEP meetings and this year's actions against high-stakes testing. The attacks on teachers in public education are not slowing, but the potential of a united coalition of labor and communities and the possibility of a movement that can fight and win is most certainly here. While Moore didn't win the UFT leadership, and we may not for some time, we have an important role to play. We will continue to forge alliances and push our union leadership to the left. The louder and more organized we are, the more pressure they feel to act like the union that we want them to be. And when they don't, we will. Ultimately, as socialists within the New York City Teachers Union, we're working to build a democratic, rank-and-file-led union that forges alliances with other unions, community groups, parents, and students to build a multiracial, grassroots movement to defend public education and stand up for the rights of teachers, students, and their communities.
Wow, so it's going to be tough to follow all of that, but I do, just based on it, I've heard such amazing things about you. I work with Mahoma at the Laundry Workers Center. I've worked with Michelle. I've worked with Sarah in some capacity. So
That article will see the light of day. So
it's so it's I guess because I'm the last here, and my task was to discuss organizing for a radical vision. You know, I think the speakers have all really touched on some of the more hopeful prospects in the social justice movement and the labor movement. I personally, and you know, I'm not a political economist, I don't have a lot of facts, but I do have the experience of the last 10 years of organizing, coming in on this wave, really this hopeful wave of immigrant organizing, low-wage worker organizing, some of the really exciting developments in the labor movement, so I can speak on that and really just try and draw out some of the examples from that experience, obviously with an eye towards what do we do next, right? We have all of these incredibly hopeful developments, but there's, you know, we have a very, very bleak future ahead of us if we don't capitalize on those developments and really push the envelope to build for a radical vision in organizing and build towards socialism. Plain and simple. There's no way around it, right? So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, and I guess I'll start with Domestic Workers United. I started organizing in 2003 with Domestic Workers United before they had really built up this, you know, this huge movement. In New York City, we were just trying to pass a nanny bill, which would provide just the most minimum basic protections for nannies in New York City. And then building towards the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which was eventually passed in 2010, which was, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've been so lucky, I've been so blessed that I've been able to be a part of these movements, witness them, work on them, and organize within these movements. And I think the domestic worker movement, as Sarah spoke of, and Michelle as well, is, you know, just, we couldn't have any clearer example of the blatant racism in this country, the blatant racism of the labor movement. The fact that these workers, along with farm workers and other excluded workers, were explicitly left out of the National Labor Relations Act to keep them in chains. And here I am working on a bill in 2010 and having to sit in Albany with these bastards and having to explain to them that these workers don't have the most basic protections, that I have to sit and fight with Upper East Side mothers who are telling me they're going to go bankrupt now just because they have to pay their domestic worker a few more dollars a week. And really, I mean, talk about like the clearest example of like, holy crap, we have so far to go. And I have to say, the AFL-CIO was wonderful eventually, right? All of these organizations, all these women's rights organizations that signed on, they were wonderful eventually. But it took years to build that up. This was not a clear shot for people right away. They weren't like, oh, well, this makes sense. Let's provide some basic labor protections to women who talk about care work. The hardest work, hands down, out there, care work. Okay? And not only the most physically taxing, but you can't imagine what these women have to go through. A few men, but women, right? And all predominantly, 99.9% women of color. And so when I think about that development and the excitement of that time where we got this Bill of Rights, and low-wage worker organizing was really right. You know, we had the Restaurant Opportunity Center, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, a lot of worker centers, the worker center movement in itself, right? This wave of low-wage, primarily immigrant worker organizing. And here we are years later, you know, we have the fast food campaigns, and I want to, Sarah, I want to bring up the fast food campaign because I think it's really important, okay? Because I also want to talk about the larger unions, and there's a reason, because low-wage worker organizing and worker center organizing, when we talk about this wave of radical organizing, it's important for us to be very honest with ourselves. When we criticize mainstream labor, the faults of mainstream labor, their really wretched history, right? If we look at the dark underbelly of the labor movement and the promise that the low-wage immigrant movement, or you know, this movement has in the United States as a catalyst for change, very easily can fall into the same pitfalls, unfortunately, that the labor movement has fallen into, right? These are worker centers that are dependent on funding from nonprofits, okay? And this is going to bring me into Laundry Worker Center. I've been so blessed to be a part of this organization because myself and Virgilio Arena, who couldn't be here, he's one of the founders of Laundry Worker Center. This was a worker center that was founded by workers. Not only workers laboring in the low-wage service industry in New York City, but workers that tried to organize with other worker centers. And for some reason or another, and they all have different stories, didn't have their needs met for a number of reasons. And so we started Laundry Worker Center first to organize the low-wage, all of the laundromats in New York City. These little independent laundromats that are guilty of just insane wage theft and exploitation. And the first group of workers that came were from Hot Crusty. And Mahoma spoke about the Leadership Institute, right? So this is an organization we've only been around for about a year and a half, but we have absolutely no funding. We're all volunteer organizers, right? We set up this Leadership Institute to not lead the struggles. Like so many organizers, I mean, let's be frank. There are organizers even in the worker center movement that take that leadership role away from the workers. They take their political capital away. They take their agency away, and they say, "Can you come speak at this conference? We need a domestic worker, but just keep it to 2 minutes, and I'll take it from there." It happens. It happens. And I think we have to be really honest with ourselves, because I think that we're grasping at these really positive examples within the labor movement that we're not really being honest about what some of those pitfalls could be, and that's going to be really, really, really dangerous for us. Because we have to, you know, I myself have made such a huge, you know, I've grown so much as a human being, as an organizer, witnessing, being able to be on the, you know, in this Hot Crusty campaign, because truly these workers were trained and organized and took the lead on their own. We didn't have any funding from any nonprofits. We didn't have to appeal to the Ford Foundation to say, this is our executive director, this is our board, whatever. Right. These are just organizers who were themselves the workers, who understood better than any of us the crisis of capitalism, who understood better than any of us what exploitation was. They don't have to sit through a 3-hour class on Lenin and Marx. They understand. They came from Mexico, from El Salvador, from Honduras. They came from all over the South, the global South, to come and labor here on the Upper East Side, serving food to some of the nastiest human beings. They've gone through, but they organized, and they led the trainings, and then they took action in the workplace, and we were in the back leading, basically taking their lead. You know, not deciding what actions make sense, not deciding what they should do, not deciding, and also taking the power out of the attorney's hands, right? Because how many of these struggles do we have? You know, I look, unfortunately, after we passed the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, there was a huge kind of dip in that momentum, right? Because we had this huge, huge, amazing national movement, and then the bill was passed. Now what? Domestic workers still don't have power, right? So it wasn't built from the grassroots, and that's not to take anything away from the amazing accomplishments of Domestic Workers United, the National Domestic Workers Alliance. You know, we're going to see some really, really big growth and progress in that movement, not only nationally but internationally. But I think it's really instructive for us to look at these examples of low-wage worker organizing over the last 10 years to say what has worked and what hasn't. You look at the Hot Crusty campaign, we had no funding, but these were workers that were mobilized on their own. We provided the training about just basics. This is labor law. This is the history of labor law. This is, these are your rights and your lack of rights in this country as an immigrant. These are the boss's tactics. I like to tell this story. I don't know. This is my favorite story from the campaign. Is that when we filed with the NLRB for an election, they said they paid $500,000. We later found out for a union busting thug from New Jersey who was kicked out of his local. He's now a union busting consultant. He came into the store. He came into Hot Crusty to try and intimidate the workers about their immigration status, and he said he was with the Department of Labor. And Mahoma, he knew this was BS immediately, and the other workers knew. And they said, "Oh, can I have a card if you're from the Department of Labor?" And this guy shit his pants and he ran out. And that's just one little anecdote. I mean, there were so many gems in this campaign, but I think I want to bring this to the larger picture. Is that we won this historic victory. Hot Crusty is a unionized shop. They have a contract. I don't know for any of you that have followed. This is a unionized shop. We know inevitably we're going to have to continue to keep pressure on the bosses. They're already trying to make little tweaks, right? Hire. By the way, we want a union shop. When does that happen? A union hiring hall. When does that happen? The workers have full discretion over who is hired into that shop. So this was really unprecedented. But we spent months on that picket line. And I see a lot of faces in the audience who supported that picket line. But to get labor, I remember having some really awkward conversations with the Central Labor Council over this, because I would call them and I'd say, "Are you kidding me? Can you just send us some bagels, some pizza, anything, right? Like, if you are not behind this little shop of immigrant workers who took bolder action than any of the unions in the CLC could ever take." They put everything on the line, because they're not just putting their jobs on the line, they're putting their families on the line, their remittances back home, their status in this country. They put it all on the line. And you can't even come out to the picket line. We're doomed. The labor movement is doomed. But, the positive in all of that is that, when I look around the table, when I think of Michelle, I just think of all of these amazing organizers that I've had the honor of working with over the last 10 years. And I have to note that this is a generational gap, right? Like, I still have really awkward conversations with folks that have been in that, and this is, by the way, there's no one in this room, because you're all incredible. But really awkward, John. There's so many faces in this room that I want to thank for a lot of things, but when I talk to some folks who have been worn down in the labor movement, year after year, decade after decade, and we have this conversation about capitalism. Why is it not okay to talk about capitalism still? We still cannot have that conversation. And I say to these people, my generation is going to be the generation that's going to change that. Right. So they're up there front and center talking about capitalism because they've experienced the worst of it. Yeah. And we have these white union members who still cannot talk about capitalism. We have people who are so safe, who are so comfortable, who can't talk about capitalism. And as I kind of progressed through these wonderful movements, and I ended up, actually, it's funny, Will, that you're here, because I want to talk about some of the, I've organized a group of ESL instructors at Kaplan. And some of the most awkward conversations I have ever had with union officials have been at the newspaper guild, right? Having a conversation with someone about how capitalism works, and it just needs to be a little more compassionate. And what's May Day? What's May Day? They celebrate May Day. Their day is Labor Day, and we all get on a float, and so rooting out, right? Those people, those union folks are going to be extinct so quickly. Just like my hope is that these dinosaurs from the UFT will be extinct. And so Michelle's point, you gotta get on the fucking boat or you gotta get off, right? Because it's really that simple. If you do not ride in on this wave and talking about building a radical vision. It's going to encompass all of these beautiful developments in the labor movement, but it's also going to be changing the dynamic just in our lexicon alone, right? Like, it should be okay that workers can speak about the system, even if they don't name capitalism. It should be okay to speak about the system. It should be okay to speak about the inequity and the barbarism of this system. And then I look at, for instance, I'm working now at the New York State Nurses Association. I see Sean is in the back. We're really lucky that we have an executive director that, for instance, will even speak about universal health care. That's a positive development, right? I was in a meeting with her the other day. She mentioned the word capitalism 3 times. I was like, yes. Keep talking about it. I'll take it a step further, right? Really supporting that, right? So really building within the membership to root out these really toxic elements within our unions and supporting low-wage worker organizing, but also being very honest with ourselves about falling into the same pitfalls that the capitalist system sets up for us, right? So it doesn't matter how beautiful the low-wage worker movement is, if it falls into that same morass of just, having to appeal to funders and having to just and I've seen it in a lot of worker centers where you actually have to quiet and stifle the voices of the more radical members. I've seen socialists, I've seen Marxists, slowly but surely, in a very quiet way, be rooted out of these worker centers. And we know that happens in unions. And so we're going to fall into the same kind of trends, unfortunately, in these more exciting developments within the labor movement. So really paying attention to that and supporting those workers. I haven't always fallen on the right favor, maybe, of some of these folks, because I continue, and I always will, even if I'm ostracized or pushed to the sidelines, supporting the workers, putting them front and center, providing them with whatever education about the system is necessary, whether it's the legal system, the immigration system, but letting them be front and center and be agents of change within their workplaces and their communities, and not being afraid to talk about capitalism.